In 1943, inside a hidden workshop somewhere in the English countryside, a British SOE officer carefully unwrapped a package just delivered from the United States. The object inside looked strangely out of place in the world's most technologically advanced war. It was a crossbow, not a medieval relic taken from a castle wall, but a modernized weapon built with aluminium and rubber, designed in secrecy by American engineers. It was called the Little Joe. It weighed just over 2 pounds, could launch a metal-tipped bolt at high speed, and, most importantly, made almost no sound. The Americans believed they had created the perfect silent assassination weapon. The British officer was not convinced. What followed would quietly end one of the strangest weapons programs of the Second World War and reveal why medieval ideas could not always survive contact with modern combat by 1942. Both British and American intelligence services faced the same brutal problem. How do you kill a man without anyone hearing it? Across occupied Europe, resistance networks lived and died by silence. German sentries guarded rail lines, bridges, fuel depots, and checkpoints that resistance fighters needed to sabotage. Collaborators had to be removed quietly. Couriers had to pass through guarded zones at night. Any loud noise, even one gunshot, could unravel an entire operation. Silence was not just useful, it was survival. Every available method had serious limitations. A knife demanded extreme proximity. The famous Fairbairn-Sykes commando dagger was lethal in trained hands, but using it required getting within arm's reach of an armed and alert soldier. That meant approaching unseen from behind, timing the strike perfectly, and overpowering a physically prepared opponent in an instant. A single mistake meant death. Garrots and wire loops were just as risky. They required the target to remain unaware until the final moment. Even the slightest movement or sudden turn of the head ruined the attack. Firearms, of course, offered range, but even suppressed pistols were far from silent in the early 1940s. Sound suppressors of the era could reduce a gunshot, but not eliminate it. In a quiet village at night, even a muffled crack could be heard hundreds of yards away. Worse, suppressors degraded quickly. After only a handful of shots, their noise-reducing ability dropped sharply. Intelligence planners dreamed of a weapon that combined the silence of a blade with the distance of a firearm. Something that could kill from across a courtyard without alerting anyone nearby. Two American engineers working for the newly formed Office of Strategic Services. The answer seemed to lie in the distant past. Crossbows had been used for centuries precisely because they were quiet. Long before gunpowder-dominated warfare, crossbows had allowed assassins and skirmishers to strike silently from a distance. The principle was sound, the engineers argued. The technology simply needed to be updated for modern war. In October 1942, the OSS formally tasked the National Defense Research Committee with developing a compact, concealable silent weapon for covert operations. The original demands bordered on fantasy. The weapon was expected to reach nearly 1,000 feet per second, reload in half a minute, be completely silent, easily hidden under clothing, and reliably kill a German sentry at 30 yards. Engineers quickly understood that some of these goals conflicted with physics, but the urgency of the request reflected how desperately such a tool was wanted. Oversight of the project fell to Stanley Peelup, the OSS Director of Research and Development, a chemist by training and one of the most inventive figures in America's secret war. His colleagues joked that he resembled Professor Moriarty, the criminal mastermind from the Sherlock Holmes stories, not because of any villainy but because of his relentless fascination with unconventional weapons. Lovell had spent time in Britain studying SOE's dirty tricks, programs, and returned to the United States. Convinced that unorthodox weapons would be central to intelligence warfare, the engineering team assigned to the crossbow project belonged to a secretive research group later nicknamed the Sandman Club. They quickly discovered that traditional crossbow designs were useless for their purposes. Medieval crossbows were heavy, awkward, slow to reload, and required massive draw weights. A knight's arbalest could punch through armor, but no secret agent could slip one under a coat and move through a German checkpoint unnoticed. Something entirely new was required. After experimenting with several propulsion concepts, the team adopted a surprisingly simple solution. Instead of wooden or steel bow limbs, they used rubber. Dozens of rubber bands arranged in parallel would store energy quietly and compactly. The system was mechanically simple, produced little noise, and could be maintained in the field with readily available materials. By early 1943, the result was ready for testing. The engineers named it the Little Joe. The Little Joe barely resembled any crossbow from history. Its frame was cast from heat-treated aluminium, shaped like a pistol grip with a rectangular housing mounted on top. Inside this housing, 50 rubber bands provided the weapon's power. Instead of a wooden shaft, the bolt was aluminium with a metal broadhead tip and feathered In essence, it was closer to an advanced slingshot than a medieval bow. But the principle was identical. Silent mechanical energy converted into lethal force. On paper, the Little Joe was impressive. It weighed only about 2.25 pounds. Measured roughly 13 inches in length, and stood about 8 inches high. Trained operators could fire up to 4 shots per minute. In test conditions, skilled shooters achieved tight groupings at 20 yards. The bolts themselves weighed around 8 ounces each. At 30 yards, testing showed that a bolt could pass completely through a human torso, even through clothing and light equipment. Most attractive of all was the sound signature. Test reports recorded the Little Joe at approximately 72 decibels when fired. That placed it around the level of a normal conversation. Compared to suppressed pistols of the era, it was extraordinarily quiet. In a noisy outdoor environment, it might pass almost unnoticed. 2 American designers. It appeared they had finally solved the silent killing problem. Encouraged by the initial results, the OSS funded a much larger version. This heavy weapon became known as the Big Joe 5. It was a shoulder-fired system weighing around 10 pounds, built with a rigid triangular frame and a wire stock that doubled as a cocking lever. Its power came from 300 rubber rings, generating a draw weight of roughly 550 pounds. No human could cock it manually. Operators had to use a windlass mechanism, cranking the rubber into position before each shot. The Big Joe fired long aluminum darts to distances of 80 yards and could launch special incendiary bolts out to 200 yards. Where Little Joe was meant for close-range assassination, Big Joe was envisioned as a silent sentry killer and sabotage tool. A third model, known as the William Tell, followed as an intermediate design, slimmer than the Big Joe, and equipped with a cable winch rather than a ratchet cocking bar. It proved to be the quietest of all, at around 66 decibels during testing in 1945. However, by the time it was ready, the war was nearing its end, and the design never progressed beyond evaluation. Despite the ingenuity poured into these weapons, production numbers remained tiny. Only a few dozen examples across all models were ever built. These were not production weapons. They were experimental devices under review. The distinction would soon prove critical. In 1943, American intelligence shared the Little Joe with their British allies. One complete example with its bolts was transferred to the Special Operations Executive for evaluation. This handoff gave rise to later myths of SOE agents stalking German sentries with crossbows. The reality, however, was far less dramatic. SOE already possessed one of the most inventive covert weapons programs in the world. Station 9, their principal research facility, operated from a quiet country estate and developed everything from explosive rats to coal filled with plastic explosives. From time-delay detonators disguised as everyday objects to powders that could incapacitate entire groups of soldiers, their entire mission was unconventional warfare. If any organization on Earth was likely to embrace a silent crossbow, it was SOE. Yet SOE's engineers had already approached the silent killing problem from a different direction and had arrived at a weapon that looked nothing like a bow. By the time the Americans demonstrated the Little Joe, the British solution was already in advanced development before the British decision became final. The Americans conducted realistic field trials. One of the most important evaluations was carried out by Captain Homer Williams of the Alamo Scouts, an elite reconnaissance unit operating in the Pacific. His task was straightforward: determine whether the Little Joe was suitable for actual assassination work under combat conditions. Williams' verdict was harsh. He confirmed that the weapon was powerful and accurate. At 30 yards, it could reliably penetrate a human target, but he focused on what happened after the hit. Unlike a bullet to the head, a crossbow bolt did not guarantee instant incapacitation. In several test scenarios, the wounded target still had time to move, thrash, or cry out. Williams described the effect bluntly, stating that a struck man might still flop around like a chicken with its head cut off, and create noise. That single observation doomed the entire concept. In clandestine operations, speed and silence are everything. The ideal assassination weapon does not merely kill, it instantly prevents any reaction. A victim who can scream, stagger, or knock over equipment for even a few seconds can compromise an entire mission. In the typical imagined scenario, 2 sentries guarding a rural checkpoint at night, an agent would fire at the first man. If that man cried out, the second would immediately raise the alarm. The agent, the resistance cell, and anyone nearby would be lost. Williams ultimately concluded that suppressed pistols, despite their noise and mechanical complexity, were still more reliable for covert killing. Neither the OSS nor SOE moved forward with the crossbow as a standard operational weapon. The British solution, meanwhile, had emerged earlier and from a much simpler philosophy. In 1942, SOE engineers at Station 9 developed a weapon known as the well rod. Its name came from the location of its development rather than from any descriptive function. What made the well rod extraordinary was how deliberately unremarkable it appeared. Disassembled, it resembled an assortment of meaningless tubes, not unlike parts of a bicycle pump. This was intentional. If an agent were captured and searched, the components would not immediately betray their true purpose. Assembled, the well rod was essentially a long tube with a crude grip and trigger. There was no external hammer, no visible magazine, nothing that would instantly identify it as a firearm to a casual observer. Its mechanical operation was as simple as possible. It used a manually operated bolt rather than a semi-automatic mechanism, eliminating the noise of a cycling slide. Its true innovation lay in its suppression system. Surrounding the barrel were rubber wipes discs that sealed tightly around the bullet as it passed through, trapping the expanding gases that normally produce a gunshot's report. When new, these wipes could reduce the sound of a fired round to around 73 decibels, comparable to snapping fingers. In practical use, agents often pressed the muzzle directly against the target's body or skull, eliminating almost all audible sound. The Welrod was produced in two main calibers. The Mark I fired the 9mm Parabellum round, allowing agents to resupply ammunition from captured German stocks. The Mark II and IIA used the smaller .32 ACP cartridge, which was easier to suppress but still lethal at close range. Magazine capacity varied between 6 and 8 rounds. The suppressor wipes degraded after about 10 to 15 shots, but for assassination work, that limitation was trivial. Most missions required only 1 or 2 carefully placed rounds. Most importantly, the Welrod provided what the crossbow never could: guaranteed instant incapacitation. A contact headshot with a suppressed 9mm bullet leaves no opportunity for movement, screaming, or reaction. The target drops immediately. The agent moves on. The difference in how seriously each weapon was adopted becomes clear when production numbers are examined. While the OSS built only a few dozen crossbows of all types combined, British factories produced Welrods in the thousands. Exact figures remain disputed, with estimates ranging from under 3,000 to over 10,000, depending on which archival sources are consulted. Nevertheless, the order of magnitude difference is undeniable. The Welrod was not an experiment. It was a fielded weapon. Captured German intelligence reports confirmed that. Welrods were recovered from resistance caches across occupied Europe. German special operations units, including those under Otto Skorzeny, were known to have studied captured examples. The weapon achieved what's so needed: a silent, deniable, instantly lethal tool for close-range killing. By contrast, the crossbow quietly vanished from the battlefield before it ever truly arrived. Despite persistent rumors and later popular myths, no verified account has ever confirmed operational use of the Little Joe, Big Joe, or William Tell in combat. Researchers examining both OSS and SOE archives have found documentation of development and testing, but nothing proving deployment on real missions. Even the most detailed technical study of the program, published decades later, could not identify a single instance of field use. The secrecy surrounding wartime intelligence further complicates the historical record. Many SOE files were destroyed after the war, some by accident and some by design. It remains theoretically possible that isolated missions occurred without surviving documentation, but the absence of evidence, when set against the abundance of material on Welrod operations, strongly suggests that the crossbows never moved beyond the testing phase. Today, only one verified Little Joe survives in a public collection. It was rediscovered in British military storage in 2005 and transferred to the Royal Armouries in Leeds, where it remains on display along with several of its original bolts. 2 Big Joe weapons are believed to survive in private collections, though their whereabouts are not publicly confirmed. Most others were scrapped after the war as obsolete curiosities. The fate of the crossbow program illustrates an important truth about weapons development in wartime. Ingenuity alone does not guarantee success. The Little Joe was an inventive weapon. It was lightweight, accurate, and remarkably quiet. From a purely engineering perspective, it worked. But warfare does not reward clever mechanisms. It rewards outcomes. And the one outcome the crossbow could not guarantee was the one that mattered most: instantaneous silence. The British Welrod, by comparison, was ungainly and limited. It was slow to reload. Its suppressor degraded quickly. Its effective range was extremely short, yet it solved the actual operational problem. It killed instantly and without sound. It could be concealed, disassembled, and denied. It met the brutal requirements of clandestine warfare, not in theory but in practice. When German guards across occupied Europe began to fear the unseen hand of resistance assassination, they were not imagining medieval bolts emerging from the darkness. They feared the strange, nondescript tubes recovered from captured caches, weapons that made no sound at all when they fired and left no warning until it was too late. The crossbow program remains a fascinating detour in the history of secret weapons. It represents a moment when engineers attempted to revive an ancient technology for the most modern of wars. It demonstrates how desperation can drive innovation in unexpected directions. But it also demonstrates that even brilliant ideas can fail when confronted by the unforgiving realities of combat. The surviving Little Joe in its museum case is more than a curiosity. It is a reminder that not every clever design finds a place on the battlefield. Some weapons exist only to teach their creators what does not work. In this case, the lesson was harsh but clear. A weapon that is merely quiet is not silent enough. In the shadow world of espionage and resistance, silence must be absolute, and death must be immediate. The Americans learned that lesson through careful testing, rather than through catastrophic failure in the field. The British had already learned it through their own experience. The crossbow stayed behind glass and paperwork. The Welrod went into occupied Europe, and in that quiet decision lies the real history of how modern intelligence learned to kill without a sound.